Anderson Cooper has spent 3 decades asking the questions no one else will. He's interviewed dictators, war criminals, grieving families, and some of the most powerful people on Earth. But on a Sunday evening that would become legendary in broadcast journalism, Anderson Cooper faced something he hadn't encountered in his entire career. A duchess, so convinced of her own righteousness that she couldn't recognize the trap closing around her with every answer she gave. Meghan Markle sat down across from Anderson, expecting sympathetic questions and platform to share her carefully rehearsed talking points. What she got instead was surgical precision, quiet devastation, and the slow, methodical exposure of every contradiction she'd spent years trying to hide. By the time the cameras stopped rolling, one of America's most respected journalists had done something unprecedented. Ended an interview early and asked the Duchess of Sussex to leave. The footage would be replayed for years. The damage would last even longer. Before we dive into this explosive story, make sure you hit subscribe and smash that like button. We bring you the most shocking moments in media every single week. Now let's get into exactly what happened in that interview room. The 60 Minutes interview setup was deliberately sparse. 2 chairs facing each other, soft lighting, cameras positioned to capture every micro-expression. No studio audience, no applause, no distractions, just 2 people, and the truth that would emerge between them. Meghan Markle entered the room with an entourage that seemed excessive for a taped interview. Handlers, publicists, a personal assistant, and what appeared to be a media consultant whispering last-minute advice. Anderson watched as they fussed over Meghan's positioning, her lighting, her water glass placement. Finally, they retreated, leaving the 2 of them alone except for the cameras. Meghan settled into her chair with a posture that somehow managed to project both vulnerability and superiority. The practiced ease of someone who'd been trained to look relatable while feeling anything but. "Thank you for doing this," Anderson said, his voice carrying its characteristic calm warmth. "Thank you for having me," Meghan replied. But there was something in her tone, a subtle condescension, as if she were granting an audience rather than sitting for an interview. "Before we start the formal interview, I just want to establish some ground rules. I'm going to ask you questions. Some will be easy, some won't. My job is to get honest answers. Your job is to give them. Fair?" Meghan's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm always honest. That's rather the point of everything I do." "Good. Then we should have no problems." The cameras began rolling. Anderson leaned forward slightly, his posture open but focused. "Let's start with where you are now. You've been in California for several years. You've built a new life, started various projects, established a foundation. How would you describe this chapter of your life?" Meghan nodded, seemingly pleased with the soft opening. "This chapter has been about freedom. For the first time in my adult life, I'm able to make my own choices, live on my own terms. It's been liberating. Liberating from what specifically? From the constraints of the institution, from the constant scrutiny, from expectations that had nothing to do with who I actually am." Anderson nodded thoughtfully. "You mentioned constant scrutiny, but you've arguably received more media coverage since leaving than you did while you were a working royal. You've done Netflix documentaries, podcast deals, countless interviews. How do you reconcile wanting less scrutiny with actively seeking more platforms?" Meghan's expression flickered, the first hint of defensiveness. "There's a difference between scrutiny and storytelling. I'm not being scrutinized now. I'm choosing to share my perspective. But the end result is the same, isn't it? Your life is being examined, discussed, analyzed. The only difference is who's doing the examining. The difference is consent. I consent to this. I didn't consent to tabloid intrusion. Fair enough? But consent to scrutiny is still scrutiny. You've invited millions of people into your life through your own projects. Can you really complain about attention when you've actively cultivated it?" Meghan's jaw tightened. "I'm not complaining. I'm distinguishing between wanted attention and unwanted attention." "Exactly." Anderson tilted his head. "And where does this interview fall? Wanted attention? Of course. I'm here voluntarily, so if I ask you difficult questions you might not want to answer, That still wanted attention? Meghan paused. That depends on the questions. I think it depends on the answers. Let's find out. Anderson shifted his position slightly, a subtle signal that the warm-up was over. You've spoken extensively about your struggles, mental health challenges, feeling isolated, experiencing hostility from the institution. Those are serious claims that deserve serious attention. But I want to ask you something that might be uncomfortable. Meghan nodded stiffly. Go ahead. You've attributed much of your suffering to the institution, the palace, the press, the pressure. But you entered that world voluntarily. You pursued a relationship with a prince, knowing what the royal family entailed. How do you reconcile presenting yourself as a victim of something you actively chose? Meghan's expression hardened. No one can fully understand what they're getting into until they're inside it. That's true of many things, but you were an adult. You had resources to research. You'd been in the public eye before as an actress. The claim that you were completely blindsided seems incomplete. I was blindsided by the cruelty, by the institutional hostility, by the racism. You've mentioned racism multiple times. Can you be more specific about what occurred? Meghan's voice cooled. I've already discussed this. I'm not going to relive every painful moment for your audience. I'm not asking you to relive everything. I'm asking for specifics about a very serious accusation. You've implied the royal family made racist remarks about your son's skin color. You've never named who said it or what exactly was said. That leaves everyone under suspicion. I protected the person by not naming them. You protected someone while destroying everyone else's reputation with suspicion. Now the entire family is suspected. Is that better? Is blanket accusation more ethical than specific one? Meghan went quiet for a moment. I was trying to preserve relationships. By publicly accusing the family of racism without saying who? That doesn't preserve relationships. It poisons all of them. Everyone wonders if they're the one you meant. Everyone feels accused. That wasn't my intention. What was your intention? Because from an outside perspective, vague accusations serve the accuser. They can't be disproven. They can't be addressed. They just linger. And lingering accusations are very useful for narrative control. Meghan's composure was cracking visibly. Her practiced warmth had given way to something colder. You're doing exactly what the British press did. Questioning my credibility instead of engaging with my experience. Anderson didn't rise to the bait. His voice remained calm, almost gentle. I'm doing what any reasonable person does when presented with serious claims, asking for evidence. That's not attacking your credibility. That's basic journalism. And the fact that you interpret questions as attacks is concerning. Your questions have an agenda. My agenda is clarity. I want to understand what happened and why. You've made public accusations that have global implications. The British monarchy's reputation has been affected. Family relationships have been damaged. All based on claims you won't substantiate. I'm asking you to substantiate them. I don't owe you substantiation. You don't owe me anything. But you did choose to make these claims publicly. And public claims invite public scrutiny. You can't have it both ways. You can't demand to be believed while refusing to provide details. Meghan stood up slightly, then sat back down. A false start that betrayed her agitation. Can we change the subject? Of course. How's Harry? The shift in Meghan's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. Walls going up, expression closing off. I'd prefer not to discuss my husband. Anderson's eyebrows rose slightly. But he's central to your entire public narrative. Your love story, your departure from royal life, your shared victimhood. It's all joint. How can we discuss your journey without discussing him? We can discuss my individual experience. Which is what exactly? Because everything you've shared publicly involves Harry. The Netflix documentary featured both of you. The discussions of leaving the royal family were about both of you. Your foundation is joint. What is your individual experience separate from him? Meghan paused, seemingly unable to answer. Anderson continued gently. I'm not trying to trap you, I'm genuinely asking. You've positioned yourself as part of a team. When you remove the team from the conversation, what's left? I have my own identity. I'm sure you do. But you haven't shown it to the public. Everything we know about your post-royal life involves Harry. So when you say you don't want to discuss him, you're essentially saying you don't want to discuss your entire public existence. Meghan's voice sharpened. My relationship is private. Anderson smiled slightly. The first time any emotion beyond professional curiosity had crossed his face. Private? Meghan, you published your relationship in a 6-hour Netflix documentary. You discussed intimate details of your marriage on Oprah. You've shared personal conversations, private moments, family conflicts. Where exactly is the privacy? I can choose what to share and when. Of course you can. But you can't claim privacy for things you've already made public. That's not how it works. Once you sell your story, you don't get to buy back the parts you don't want discussed. The tension in the room was palpable now. Anderson remained calm, but his questions were becoming sharper. Let's talk about your projects, the Netflix deal, the Spotify podcast, the various ventures you've announced. How's that going? Meghan's expression flickered with something. Irritation, perhaps, or the awareness that this was dangerous territory. It's going well. We're doing important work through our foundation. Meaningful content that makes a difference. Can you be specific? What content have you produced? We've done documentaries, the podcast. The podcast that ended after one season? The one where a Spotify executive called you grifters? Meghan's face flushed. That was one person's opinion. It was the head of podcasting, and his assessment seemed to be shared by the company, given that they terminated your deal early. What went wrong? Our visions didn't align. Your vision of being paid millions while producing minimal content didn't align with their vision of receiving actual content for their investment. I can see how that might create tension. That's an incredibly unfair characterization, is it? You signed a deal reportedly worth $20 million. You produced 12 podcast episodes over 3 years. That's less than 4 episodes per year. Most podcasters produce 4 episodes per month. What were you doing with the rest of that time? We were being thoughtful about content. Quality over quantity. Quality requires actual product. What you delivered was sparse. And the company that paid you clearly agreed, given how things ended. Meghan's voice rose. You don't understand the pressures we were under. What pressures? You were being paid millions to create content. You had complete creative control. You had every resource you could want. What pressure exactly prevented you from producing the work you were paid to produce? Meghan had no answer. Anderson continued. And then there's Netflix. Several of your projects were canceled recently. The animated series, some documentary concepts. What happened there? Projects evolve. That's the nature of the entertainment industry. Evolve is a generous word for canceled. And the pattern is concerning. Spotify ended badly. Netflix projects are getting dropped. At what point do we stop blaming the companies and start examining whether maybe, the problem is the product? Meghan stood up fully. The movement sudden enough to startle the crew members watching. This is exactly what I expected. Another interview disguised as journalism that's actually just an attack. Anderson remained seated, looking up at her with an expression of mild curiosity. Which questions were attacks? I asked about your experience. You said you were blindsided. I asked for specifics about racism. You refused. I asked about Harry. You invoked privacy. I asked about your projects. You blamed others. At what point did any of that constitute an attack? Your tone. My tone has been calm, professional, and curious. The same tone I use with everyone. If it feels hostile to you, maybe examine why basic questions about your own public statements feel like hostility. You're not asking questions, you're prosecuting. I'm asking you to explain things you've publicly claimed. That's not prosecution, that's accountability. And the fact that you can't tell the difference is exactly the problem I keep noticing in all your interviews. Any question you don't like becomes an attack. Any scrutiny becomes persecution. It's a very effective shield, but it's not honest engagement. Meghan grabbed her water glass, then set it down without drinking. I don't have to justify myself to you. No, you don't. But you're on 60 Minutes. You agreed to this interview. You walked in here knowing what kind of program this is. We don't do puff pieces. We ask hard questions. If you wanted soft treatment, you came to the wrong place. I didn't want soft treatment. I wanted fair treatment. This is fair. Fair means I ask real questions and you give real answers. You've given me deflection, hostility, and claims you won't substantiate. That's not my failing. That's yours. Meghan moved toward the door, then stopped, turning back for what seemed like a final confrontation. You know what I've noticed about journalists like you? You claim objectivity while pursuing agendas. You ask questions that are actually accusations. You pretend you're seeking truth while actually seeking gotcha moments. Anderson stood now, but slowly, without aggression. I've been doing this for 30 years, Meghan. I've interviewed people who've survived genocides. I've talked to parents who've lost children. I've sat across from dictators and victims, heroes and villains. Almost all of them, even the worst ones, managed to engage with difficult questions without treating them as personal attacks. He paused. You've treated every question tonight as if I'm your enemy. And I'm not. I was genuinely curious about your life, your choices, your perspective, but you've made understanding impossible because every question becomes an attack in your mind. Because they are attacks, they're not. How are you finding California? Is not an attack. Tell me about your projects. Is not an attack. Can you be specific about the racism you've alleged? Is not an attack. It's the most basic follow-up question any journalist would ask. Meghan's voice rose. You don't understand what I've been through. Then help me understand. That's why we're here. But helping me understand requires actual answers, not deflection. It requires specifics, not vague references to suffering. It requires engagement, not hostility. I've been engaging. You've been defending. There's a difference. Engagement means considering the questions seriously and responding thoughtfully. Defense means treating every question as a threat to be neutralized. You've been defensive since you walked in. Meghan grabbed her purse, her movements sharp with controlled fury. I'm leaving. This interview is over. Anderson nodded slowly. That's your prerogative. But before you go, I want to say something. Meghan paused, perhaps curious despite her anger. Anderson continued, his voice carrying that quiet intensity that had made him one of the most respected journalists in America. I've interviewed people accused of war crimes who stayed until the end. I've talked to politicians caught in scandals who answered every question. I've sat across from people in far worse situations than yours who engaged honestly and completely. You're leaving because I asked you to explain your own public statements. Think about what that says. It says I'm refusing to participate in a hostile interview. It says you can't defend your narrative when someone actually examines it. Your story works in controlled environments. Netflix documentaries you produce, Oprah interviews where the questions are softballs, podcasts you host yourself. It doesn't work when someone asks follow-ups. That's not my failure. That's the failure of the story itself. Meghan's face contorted with barely suppressed rage. My story is true. Parts of it may be. But stories that are completely true don't fall apart under basic questioning. They become stronger when examined. Yours doesn't. It becomes vaguer, more defensive, more dependent on accusations of hostility. That's not the behavior of truth. That's the behavior of narrative. You're calling me a liar. I'm calling you evasive. I'm calling you defensive. I'm calling you unwilling to engage with straightforward questions about your own claims. If that means liar to you, that's your interpretation, not my accusation. Meghan stood frozen in the doorway, caught between her desire to leave and her inability to let Anderson have the last word. History will vindicate me. Anderson smiled sadly. Maybe. Maybe history will see someone who had extraordinary opportunities and spent most of her time complaining about them. Someone who could have used her platform for almost anything and chose to use it primarily for grievance. Someone who had everything and still felt wronged. He paused. I hope I'm wrong. I hope you find peace. But peace isn't something you find by arguing with everyone who sees you clearly. At some point, you have to stop and wonder if maybe, the people noticing contradictions aren't the problem. Meghan opened her mouth to respond, then seemed to realize she had nothing left to say. She turned and walked out, the door closing behind her with a decisive click. Anderson sat in silence for a moment, the cameras still rolling. Then he turned to face the lens, his expression weary but resolved. Well, that was unexpected. In all my years of interviewing, I've rarely had a subject walk out before we finished. I've interviewed people accused of terrible crimes who stayed until the end. I've talked to politicians in crisis who answered every question. A duchess leaving because I asked about her projects and her racism claims. That's a first. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I want to be clear about what happened here. I asked basic questions. How are you? How are your projects going? Can you be specific about your claims? These are the same questions I'd ask any subject who'd made their personal life the center of their public narrative. Meghan has spent years talking about her experiences, her struggles, her perspective. And tonight, when I asked her to engage with that material seriously, she couldn't do it. Anderson shook his head slowly. That's not my failure. That's hers. And I suspect on some level she knows it. The anger, the defensiveness, the accusations of unfairness, those are the responses of someone who's built a narrative that can't withstand scrutiny. I didn't expose anything tonight. I just asked questions. She exposed herself with how she answered them. The interview lasted 24 minutes before Meghan walked out. Its impact would last far longer. For Anderson Cooper, it was another example of what happens when someone who's never faced real questioning finally encounters it. The pattern was familiar. Defensiveness. The only surprise was how quickly the departure came. For Meghan Markle, it was something else. A moment captured on camera that would follow her for years. Proof that her narrative, so carefully constructed over documentaries and interviews and carefully controlled media appearances, couldn't survive basic journalistic inquiry. The 60-minute stopwatch had ticked for over 50 years, marking segments that changed history, exposed corruption, and revealed truth. On this particular Sunday, it marked something simpler, but no less significant. The moment a duchess discovered that some questions don't care about titles, and some journalists don't care about walking out. What do you think? Was Anderson too persistent? Or did Meghan deserve every question? Who would you want to see on 60 Minutes next? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video to help it reach more people. Subscribe to our channel for more explosive celebrity moments.